I want to remind folks, if you put your questions on cards, they'll be brought up. We've heard some great ideas. Member-only unionism, organizing and pressuring employers, as is being done by the Guest Worker Alliance and Contingent Workforce, telling our own story while moving a community agenda, and advocating for worker-led activity. So these ideas have raised some questions. The first one's to Catherine. Currently, corporations retaliate, intimidate, harass union supporters even when they have majority support. Why do you believe corporations won't do that to union supporters when they are a minority?
I don't think that corporations won't. Corporations will harass, intimidate, fire workers, whether they're a majority or a minority. The right to engage in concerted activity for mutual aid and protection under the private sector law does not turn on whether you are a member of a majority union, a minority union, or any union at all. What I think is important is that workers be convinced, and I think Dan is exactly right and incredibly inspirational for all of us. What will make a difference is if workers stand together and fight for the rights they have. So whether it's our Walmart and its strategy of minority representation, I know their lawyers don't want to call it a union, so I'll stay out of that.
No, it's a union. We just, no collective bargaining is what we're
So, or whether it is fast food forward, or workers are going to have exactly as much power as they can garner. And so when an employer threatens to fire workers, or fast food employers did fire workers at McDonald's and other restaurants when people had strikes, what got them their jobs back was not the National Labor Relations Act. What got them their jobs back was the community banding together and walking those employees back and staring the assistant manager, regional manager, whoever the person was who fired that employee. It was getting the community to walk those workers back so that they could get their jobs back. And so in that respect, I also think what Mary Catherine said about the strategy for teachers is huge. It has to be a worker community alliance. And one of the things that minority or members-only unions can do is be that bridge between the union as we traditionally knew them and community organizations. We shouldn't just think of a union as representing the majority of the workers in the bargaining unit, whatever that is. We need to think of the union as representing the workers, the consumers who are adversely affected, the public, whoever it is, and forming those kinds of alliances. Because I think the real protection that's going to come for workers, for example, who are illegally fired for insisting on their rights and who can't wait 6 months or however long it takes the National Labor Relations Board's regional office to process the petition, the complaint challenging the firing, is the actual on-the-ground power to get those workers' jobs back.
This is a question for each of you, since it's come up several times. Based on what you presented as the theory of the case, as the way to move forward, what do you think is replicable in other sectors?
I just spoke, so why don't we start down at the other end?
I mean, I think a lot of what, I think all of it's applicable. I mean, I think, a lot of times, we feel like that there's sort of too much nuance between sort of the different sectors or whatever. I think bottom line is, right, creating space for workers to be able to lead, creating, those pathways. I mean, that's applicable everywhere. It's powerful. It's what, it's what we need to do more of. I mean, I think online organizing, as I said in my presentation, I mean, it is a game changer. And I don't think, many of us in the labor movement have begun to really take on what that means and the power that that actually has, and our ability to move conversations from an online world to ultimately an offline existence, and what that really means in terms of how we train organizers and sort of, I mean, I just think that has been, one of the biggest game changes that we've seen, but is, I mean, half the world is on Facebook, right? I mean, they're all there. They're waiting to be talked to.
I'll say that making sure that your union is in deep discussions with your communities about a common good. All right, we heard discussions of a common good before, and I think that is both, capital G, capital C, common good, the official work that is being moved in unions right now, and lowercase common good as well. And that is that, we are all really desperate to have conversations with the community where we get them to agree with our issues. And we do have to make sure that they are common good issues. And so I would say every union has a place to start in that, right? In some unions, it may be the leader of your union just needs to cultivate her own relationships with other community leaders. In other places, and I'll give you one other example of something we did with a fellow union, right? So we are the St. Paul Federation of Teachers, Local 28. We have a union in Minneapolis-St. Paul area, SEIU, Local 26. And SEIU represents a lot of the janitors who clean the office buildings in downtown Minneapolis and downtown St. Paul. They also represent security guards, and those security guards work in St. Paul Public Schools. So we actually had two different ways of connecting with them. But how we connected was not sort of union member to union member. It was teacher to parent or family member. Because the vast majority of the workers they represent were parents of St. Paul Public School kids. And so here's another union, really easy for me to pick up the phone and call that union leader. We're really close. And just let's start thinking of this differently. Your members are parents who have needs in St. Paul Public Schools, and our members are teachers. Let's see if they have some of the same needs. And that was one of the very first community partnerships we engaged on. And it really took about half a dozen people in both unions to get it started, right? We had about a half a dozen teachers and about a half a dozen parents, and we got them together to just start talking to each other. What was the experience like? What do you need? And so you don't have to start with a community listening session where you want to attract 500 people. If you have the capacity to do that, that's awesome. But you don't have to start there. But you need to start somewhere, and I think every union has the capacity to start somewhere. And it will grow from there. It absolutely will.
Yeah, I think that just where Dan had talked about it, organizing is organizing, right? Essentially you're exposing the story of what's happening to workers in the workplace. And also outside of the workplace. I bumped into Ron Alt, who was here earlier, and he was mentioning about, our signal campaign in Louisiana. This is 400 Indian iron workers, right? Metal workers, pipe fitters who are walking in, and they all paid $20,000 each to come from India to the U.S. with promises of amazing high wage, quality jobs, and a decent living standard. Instead, they were put into man camps where they were put, I think it was something like 26 workers to a trailer, right? An actual box where they lived. And it was being guarded every single day, every night. They were only allowed to leave when they would go to Walmart to go pick up groceries. And they had to go, and they actually had to pay for the gas. They had to pay for uniforms that they were never told about, and because they were tied to this employer based off of their legal status to be in this country. The exploitation and the abuse was immense. When the public actually heard about this story, imagine there was not one union that didn't call us up and said, hey, we're there in support with you guys. There wasn't anybody in the community who sat there and said, wow, we are not ashamed about this. This is normal. No, this is not normal at all. It's about exposing those stories. And then when you talk about that across sectors, J-1 visa workers. These are student workers who are put into Hershey's company to package the chocolates, and the amount of exploitation that was that they had to deal with, or the Jamaican workers in Florida who are janitorial workers who, once they started to organize, immediately the employer said, well, I'm just going to call up Mr. Clean Company, said, I'm just going to call up ICE. And ICE is, I'm going to fire these workers, call up ICE, and have them all deported. Right? I mean, this is what's been going on. Not in every single one of those cases, it was a victory for us, and the only way it was a victory was sharing the story, and then really building community and union support, assessing legal handles, of course, to make sure that everything we were doing was in the protection of these workers, and then ultimately just creating really dynamic fights. So across sectors, in different sectors, it's the same story. We have to organize.
The final thing I would say about the way in which members-only bargaining or members-only unionism is replicable is we know it's happened all over the place in the private sector and the public sector actually for quite a while. There are a number of states, fewer now than there used to be, although the number is actually growing again, that prohibit bargaining or unionization by government employees. Guess what? There have been unions among government employees who have no right to bargain for decades. Think about Arizona public safety workers. Even though the employer is not statutorily required to recognize them or is indeed prohibited from recognizing and bargaining, you can't stop people from joining an organization. There's a constitutional right to do that. And whether the employer is legally required or even permitted to bargain, it happens if the employer is persuaded that it's in their interest to do so. Tennessee, we have the high-profile experiment at VW, and people say, oh, the only reason that's happening is because VW, as a German company, is under tremendous pressure from its unions in Germany to create a works council, and the only way you can do that is if you have a union in the United States because of Section 8A2 of the National Labor Relations Act. Maybe so, maybe no, but it is replicable in other areas. We know that from the variation on members-only bargaining or minority unionism that happens at work sites where the employer just wants some group that actually represents their workers to talk about, so if they change a policy, they don't get a personnel crisis on their hands. Tennessee also, by statute, part of the wave of anti-union laws that was enacted in 2010, banned exclusive representation of teachers. Some of you in this room probably know that. So it requires, by law, members-only bargaining. That's a terrific natural experiment for, okay, once unions lost their status as exclusive representative, how did teachers continue to organize? What worked? What didn't? I suspect that when it's going to work because, or if it has worked, and I haven't studied this, you may know, because teachers are good at mobilizing parents and community members in exactly the way Mary Catherine recognizes. So there are lots of examples of where majority unionism of the sort that we've had since 1935 doesn't exist, and yet we have unions anyway. I think it's important that local journalists and anybody else, bloggers, everybody, research it, figure it out, and then publicize that story as widely as possible for exactly the reasons that you said. That's how we learn what works.
Great. Dan, this one's for you. How have you had to restructure and realign your union organization in order to work on movement building, longer-term social issues, and a movement that workers own?
Great question. I think from our beginning, those issues were always paramount and were sort of at the foundation of what we knew was needed to be built to take on a company the size and scale of Walmart. And so, so from the beginning, the worker organization that was developed with Walmart workers, our Walmart, right? That from the design was, meant to be sort of the place where workers could join together. But, and that's why then we created the Making Change Coalition, which really has been the coalition and the work on that. And, and from the beginning, it hasn't been, sort of like, hasn't been just about being in solidarity or supporting Walmart workers. I mean, the coalition is real. Like every year, the Walmart workers and the coalition get together and build a plan. It's a plan that people build together. The creativity and the ideas that come forth that build out the plan for the year is really the result of all of that being together. Walmart workers know that, they have a responsibility to mobilize and turn out. So whether, when port truckers are on strike, they're out there on the picket lines, and that there's a real two-way street and a real solidarity relationship that's built. So from the beginning, I mean, building a movement and building as broad a coalition as possible was always, one of our top goals. And so, that was our structure. And the only way you're going to build that is if it's a real partnership with people, and if people, know and understand that partnership is real. And so, so that's been our guiding principle from the beginning.
Okay. And I think I have the last question. Catherine, this is for you. In Indiana this year, a conservative legislator introduced a bill to allow public workers to opt out of contracts. Can you contrast your view of member-only bargaining with that right-wing view?
That's correct. And indeed, in Indiana, which became a right-to-work state, there was a challenge to the ability of unions, or the requirement that unions have to provide services to the free-riding, non-paying non-members. And just day before yesterday, I guess, that challenge was ultimately rejected by the federal courts by a 5-5 split. And I had actually filed an amicus brief in the case arguing exactly what I described to you here. So the risk of members-only bargaining is that workers will opt out, and that employers will use the division between the workers who support the union and those who don't to drive a wedge among workers. That's just true. I'm not advocating members-only bargaining as if it were the best strategy in an ideal world. It's not. There is a reason why people smarter than I am decided in the early 1930s to enshrine the principle of majority unionism and exclusive representation into law as the model that they envisioned would govern. The problem is that we don't live in that world anymore. I sure wish we did. I expected that when the economy started going downhill in a huge hurry in 2008, that workers would get mad and say we're mad as hell and we're not taking it anymore and go to the streets, and it didn't happen. Because people still are too libertarian, frankly, and I think not collectivist enough. But living in the world we live in, I think members-only unionism is better than no unionism, and that's the choice we face. It's not like if we just turned our back on right-to-work laws or members-only laws, somehow we could still have what the true unionists in the room really wish we had. So I'm not endorsing the right to opt out as my preferred vision. I'm endorsing it maybe as the best we can get in this far from perfect world, in the hope that workers who have a choice will see that those who choose to join, as somebody pointed out, the poll revealing, that they actually are happier, that yearning for community that I think is out there, I don't think we all want to bowl alone. I actually think we're far more communitarian than that. We need organizations in every workplace that offer that community, and when they band together, it might be that employers will take advantage of the fact that people can opt out to pay non-union workers more. And that will cause dissension, it will cause the workers who would support the union to flee the union in droves. But it might be that workers will decide, actually, we want that solidarity. Because sooner or later, the employer that manages to persuade everybody not to join the union is then going to fire the pregnant worker, or is going to, as Walmart famously did, an employee gets a brain tumor, has brain surgery, and then gets fired when he gets back from his job because his manager thinks he doesn't have his whole brain anymore, and therefore he's not as smart anymore. I mean, that's kind of outrageous. It's an old case, but it's outrageous, it's offensive, and when that happens, I think then workers will see, oh, we actually do band together because, gee, I might be the one who gets cancer. I might be the one who suffers a job-related injury and then gets fired because I can't do my job. So I do think that members-only unionism is better than nothing, and that's the world we're living in.